well, good morning, everybody. Bill Lester here with Hernando County Extension Service. Wanted to join you today for a little short class on better understanding Florida soils and nutrients. I know there's a lot of confusion about that. When I posted on Facebook a while back looking for ideas for classes, this was one of the first ones that came up. So I kind of figured we go with this. Let me double check that I'm working correctly on Facebook Live here. Okay, and I am. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and just ask your questions, just type them in right under the video here. And when I get to the end, I can go ahead and look over and read your questions, and we'll go through them and answer them one by one. But let me go ahead and open up my presentation here. And we're going to talk a little bit about soils and plant nutrition. A lot of this, and this applies whether you've moved here to Florida and you're gardening now, but you moved here from another state, or you've lived in Florida your whole life. I hear from a lot of people that you can't really grow anything in Central Florida. It's all sand. You don't have soil here. Well, it is soil. We do have soil. And as with most everything in life, there's good points and bad points to it. So when we're talking about soils, exactly what is a soil? It's a natural body comprised of the solid part, the liquid part, and the gas part that occur on the land's surface. And there's a lot of science that goes into this. You can go to University of Florida, get graduate degrees in soil science. And when I was still going there, I took classes where we learned all about soil profiles, particle size and density. We learned how to take different measurements on soils, compare different types of soils. So there's a lot of science that goes into this. And it depends on the parent material, whatever the underlying rock is, and that's different for every part of the country. Depends on the climate, because over millions of years, the climate and the weather breaks down that parent material into soil. Depends on the topography, whether you live in the mountains or whether you live on flat land, that's going to make a difference. Biological factors, there are a huge number of living organisms in just a tablespoon of average normal soil. Even here in Florida sandy soils, we have bacteria, we have fungi, there's nematodes, there's microscopic organisms, very tiny insects, and they all work together to break things down and keep them cycling through, where if everything works perfectly, it provides your plants with everything they need to grow and thrive and be happy, and everything works well. When things get really out of whack, we might have to intervene or understand what the problem is to be able to fix it. And then, of course, time. It's just taken millions of years for our soils in Florida to develop and, become the kind of soil that we have right now. So in a normal, healthy soil, you're going to have about 45% mineral, which here is silica sand, mostly, 25% water, 25% air. So if you are in a low-lying area and the water after it rains sits in your yard for days on end, you're not going to have any air in the soil. The water is going to push it out. You're going to have 50% water, 50% solid, and no air, and that's not a good situation. And then about 5% organic matter on average. Now the problem is here in Central Florida, on average, you have maybe 1% organic matter in your soil. So we're going to have to add to that and help raise the amount of that. So here in Florida, we have a lot of different types of soils. Technically, you may think it's just sand and more sand. Florida if you look back millions of years at different points, was much wider than it is now. At other points, it was almost completely underwater. So Florida is highly influenced by marine forces or sea life, sea level. And what we have underground underneath our feet is limestone. So that is where the aquifer is, all the water. I know here in Hernando County, we get all of our drinking water from the limestone aquifer underneath our feet. Limestone can either be formed into huge caverns that are filled with water. In other places, it looks more like Swiss cheese, where the empty parts are all filled with water. But essentially, we all started off with limestone as a parent material that is weathered, and organic matter has been deposited on it and it's changed, and that gives us the soil that we have right now. So when we talk about sand or clay or silt, what we're talking about is the size of the particle. So when it comes to soil particles, the largest particles are sand. And that could be, I mean, it's still small, 0.05 to 2 millimeters. That's still a pretty small particle. But technically, out of all the different types of particles that can make up a soil, sand is the largest. Clay is at the other extreme. Clay is extremely tiny little particles. The problem with clays are they compact together, and now you have very, very poor drainage because there's no air spaces in between, no place for the water to go. And then the particles that are between sand and clay, the medium-sized particles, are silt. So larger particles obviously have more space between them for air and water to sit or move through. Smaller particles like clay have very small spaces or no spaces for air or water. So you can see that sand has good parts and bad parts to it. It has very good drainage, but no water holding capacity, and clay has good parts and bad parts to it also. So what the sand or clay determines is the amount of pore space between it. So sand has macropores and has very good drainage. So when I know when I get 12 inches of rain here at my house and the water starts to back up out in the front yard, when it stops raining, 10 minutes later, it's all gone. Up north, where you have a lot more clay and you get 12 inches of rain, you'll get flooding, you'll get, rivers will overflow their banks, people, get injured and die. Here, it's just a normal afternoon or a normal tropical storm, and we recover and the water drains very quickly. The bad part of that is sandy soils have very low water holding capacity. So if you go out there and you water your garden first thing in the morning, it might dry out very quickly because the water drains so quickly. At the other extreme with clays, and we have very little clay here in Central Florida. We do have pockets. Here in Hernando County, we have some areas where there's a lot of clay in the soil, kind of unusual for Florida, but it happens. So those people can experience very poor drainage. So when they get 12 inches of rain, they may be looking at a lake in their yard for many days before it dries up or drains through. But clay, on the other hand, when you water it, holds the water very, very well for a long time. So you're not going to have to irrigate it nearly as often as if you have pure sand. So those things all figure into how well your soil drains. We do have different types of soils here in Florida that are very poorly drained. If you think about swampy areas, marshes, the water does not drain very well there at all. Spodosols, which is a type of soil that's in flatwood forest areas. Sometimes urban soils, even if it's sandy, gets very compacted through new home construction, a lot of heavy equipment driving through your neighborhood when they're in the process of building your house. So then they come along and they throw down sod, they put in plants. You may have poor drainage even though you have, very high percentage of sand. And then we have other areas that just drain extremely well. So the water drains through them really well, they never flood, but they don't hold water very well either. So you're going to have problems with plants growing. You're going to have to irrigate a lot if you're trying to grow plants. And then excessively drained soils like entosols, which are very, very good for citrus production, maybe not are as good for ornamental horticulture or vegetable gardens. So something else that figures into soils, and it's another measurement or natural component of soils, is the pH. So when we measure or talk about the pH of a soil, we're not really talking about the pH of the soil. We're talking about the pH of the water component that sits between the soil particles. So what gets measured is the water that sits in the soil, not actually the soil particles. The pH scale goes from, technically -1 or generally 0 up to 14. and then dead center in the middle is 7. So the lower the number is, the more acidic your soil or a liquid is, and the higher the number is, the more alkaline it is. With 7 being right in the middle, it's not acidic, it's not alkaline, it's technically neutral, it's right in the middle. So some things that are acidic, you can see on the list here, things like battery acid, lemon juice, vinegar, they're all very acidic. At the other end, things like ammonia, household bleach, household lye are all very alkaline. So plants have a different zone of pH that they can live and thrive in. And if you put a plant in soil that has a really, really incorrect pH for that plant, it's probably not going to do very well at all. So some examples of that, we do have plants that can be grown very well here, but they have to be grown in very acidic soils. So soils are generally very slightly acidic, usually a little bit below 7 is the average. But if you ever want to grow something like azaleas, blueberries, camellias, they need acidic soils. Blueberries have to have a soil where the pH is like between 4 and 5.5. So if you get a soil test done and your soil is, let's say, 7 or higher, blueberries are never going to grow well in the soil in your yard. You can grow them in containers. You can mix a lot of peat moss in because peat moss is very acidic, so there's some things you can do. But you need to keep in mind your natural soil pH before you go out there and start picking what kind of plants you want to grow. Almost all vegetables and flowers are range, very slightly acidic, a little bit below 7. I think technically the ideal for vegetables is about 6.5. So if your soil is anywhere near 6.5 pH, you're going to be able to grow vegetables fairly well without too many problems. With turf grasses, most turf grasses are pretty forgiving. St. Augustine, technically 6.5 is ideal. St. Augustine takes a pretty wide range of pH. An exception to that is Bahia grass. Bahia grass needs it fairly acidic. You see 5.5 here. So if you have a new home built, it's in a subdivision, they bring in topsoil or fill dirt, put it down and put in a Bahia grass lawn, and you test the pH and your pH is 7.5 or 8 or even 8.5, we see that every once in a while, your Bahia grass will not do well long term. It's going to start to suffer, look really thin, not look good. It's never going to thrive. It probably won't completely die, but it's never going to look really great either. So we always recommend before you go into a major, I'm going to resod my yard, I'm going to put in a bunch of flower beds, I'm going to want to put in azaleas, I'm going to put in a huge vegetable garden, whatever it might be. It's a really good idea to get a soil test done first, because that way it lets you know where you are, and it lets you know if there's any limits on what kind of plants you could put in that are not going to thrive and do really well. Because going back here, if your soil is naturally, let's say 7.5, and you put in a whole bunch of azaleas all around your house, they're never going to do well. There's not a whole lot you could do to lower the pH of your soil. If you live out in the country and your pH is naturally 4.5, 5, 5.5, and you want to put in St. Augustine grass or roses or something that likes a higher pH, you can put down lime. Lime is going to raise the pH of your soil, but if you have to go in the other direction, there's really nothing that's going to lower the pH of your soil. So a little note or word of warning to people. I know a lot of people move here from other states, and maybe where you move from, you were in the habit of every fall, you just go out and put down lime. And you really weren't sure why you were doing it, because you've always done it. All your neighbors did, everybody you know did. You just put down lime every fall, and people will move to Florida and think, oh, well, my grass doesn't look very good. Maybe I need to put down lime. That may be a very, very bad thing to do without getting a soil test done first. Because looking at this chart here, let's say you have a Bahia grass lawn, and it is going to be happiest if pH is 5.5, but your pH is 7.5 and it doesn't look very good. If you put down lime, what's going to happen? you're going to raise the pH even more, and you don't want to go in that direction. Ideally, you'd want to go in the other direction, so you may be taking a problem and making it worse by applying lime without getting a soil test done first. So if you're thinking, okay, well, you know, what's the really big deal about pH? You know, my soil's pH is what it is, and if I put down something that likes a fairly medium or forgiving pH, I'm going to be fine. pH plays a big chemical impact on the availabilities of different micronutrients in your lawn or in your garden. So if we're talking about nutrients, you see here is a list of all the, there's a number of different nutrients listed here that are all essential for healthy plant growth, and we're going to look a little bit more at exactly what they are. So as a general rule, if you look at the top here and your soil pH is 7.0 and you go down, that looks pretty good. The bars for the different nutrients are fairly wide, so the different nutrients are going to be chemically available to your plants in pretty good amounts. The problem occurs is when your soil pH is either unusually high or unusually low. You can start to have deficiencies of nutrients, or at the other end, toxicities of nutrients because your pH is out of whack. So something that happens very often is people will start to have micronutrient deficiencies. So if you look at some of these nutrients, things like iron, manganese, boron, and copper and zinc, they're all very important for healthy plant growth in very small amounts. But if your pH is very, very high and you have plenty of iron naturally in the soil, the iron at a high pH is going to be bound to some other nutrient in the soil, and it's not going to be plant available. So even if you have lots of iron in your soil, you go to the store, you buy a bag of ironite, and you're throwing down lots and lots of iron. If your pH is very, very high, that iron will never be available to your plants. You're going to have to know what your pH is and possibly adjust it to make the nutrients that are in the soil available for plant growth. So I don't want to get too deep into chemistry here. Chemistry tends to frighten a lot of people, and I'm technically not a chemist. I'm always worried that a professional chemist is viewing one of these presentations and kind of listening like, is he explaining that correctly? So it's very important that you understand what your soil's pH is. And if you're starting to suffer from any kind of micronutrient deficiency, it may be because of a pH issue, not because of a lack of fertilizer issue. Because we encounter people sometimes, if their pH is just not where it should be and their plant is not doing well, they fertilize it. And if it's still not doing well, they fertilize it some more, and they keep fertilizing it and keep watering it where that is not going to solve the problem. And we discourage excessive fertilization, because what happens to that fertilizer eventually? When it rains, it's going to wash off into the street, into a drainage ditch, and eventually into a waterway, or it's going to soak into the sandy soil and go into the aquifer and cause a problem there also. So we encourage people to fertilize correctly. Don't just try to solve your problems with fertilizing, because that may not do the trick. So you always want to know what your soil pH is and adjust it. So to raise the soil pH, you can add lime. And with University of Florida, if you send a sample off to get a soil test done, they will put down the lime recommendation. They even tell you how much lime to add to your soil to get it right where it should be, depending on what you're trying to grow. Lowering soil pH, very little can be done to lower it. Technically, you can use elemental sulfur. That will lower the pH of a soil. But if we're talking about a lawn or a tree or something that's going to be growing there for a long time, you're going to have to keep adding sulfur. And if you keep adding sulfur, eventually it's going to build up in the soil. You're going to get a sulfur toxicity, and then you're just throwing things even more out of whack. So what you're probably going to have to do is know what your pH is, know what your plant palette is, what you can grow successfully at that pH, and just try to stick within that framework when you're going out and making your plant choices. So what kind of things are in your soil outside? Goodness, there's a ton of, like I mentioned earlier, a huge number of living things in just a tablespoon full of soil. Everybody's familiar with earthworms. Uh, the upper right-hand corner here is a nematode. That's a greatly magnified picture of one. We have little single-cell organisms, like in the bottom right-hand corner here. All those things you learned about in high school biology 101. We have insects and centipedes and millipedes. Bottom left-hand corner here is a fungus. So you have fungi in the soil too. And they're supposed to be there. And the vast majority of them are very, very beneficial for plant growth, or they really are not impacting your plants. So if you look at the nematode in the upper right-hand corner here, healthy soil should have a huge number of different nematode species living in it. A lot of them eat bacteria or fungi. They have mouth parts that look like a shop vac, and they just crawl through the soil eating bacteria, eating fungi. There's other nematodes that eat each other. They're predatory. So they're going to keep other organisms under control, but there are some species of nematodes that feed on plant roots, and those are going to be the ones that are problems for gardeners. But if you have a healthy soil and a healthy community of different things living in the soil, you shouldn't have a huge number of bad nematodes. They're going to be eaten by good nematodes. They're going to be eaten by bacteria, by fungi. They're going to be preyed upon by other things. So you're going to have a really healthy, widespread community of living organisms in your soil, but they're all going to keep each other under control. So you're not going to have a huge outbreak of the bad guys, because the good guys are always eating them and keeping their numbers right where they should be. So something that really helps with that, and something, if you remember when I mentioned the different components of a healthy soil, ideally on average, nationwide, you're looking at about 5% organic matter. For anybody who moved here from the Midwest, like Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Illinois, they naturally have, I think, about 15% organic matter out there. Here in Florida, you're lucky if you have 1% organic matter naturally. So you're going to have to add to that. You're going to have to make compost. You're going to have to purchase compost. That's all soil organic matter. So that's the part of the soil that was once alive, but has now died and is broken down. So it's a previously living biomass that can come from plants, animals, microorganisms. It's the remains of plants and animals in different various stages of decomposition. So,
okay, I found this on the web for what is the remains of plants and animals in different various stages of all decomposition. Check it out.
So sorry about that, but with soil organic matter, that's the organic matter component of the soil. So it was plant and animal residues at different various stages of decomposition. What organic matter does is, if you have a sandy soil, like I mentioned, it drains really well, but the problem is it drains a little bit too well. If you add a lot of organic matter in with your soil, it's going to help to hold the water better, and it holds nutrients better. So when you do fertilize your plants, it's the organic matter that holds onto those nutrients for a while until the plant roots have a chance to go ahead and find those nutrients and take them up. If you have a heavier soil, if you're one of those few people that has a lot of clay naturally in their soils, it's going to help loosen the soil some, so it's going to drain better. So organic matter is going to help to create an ideal soil structure with whatever type of soil you naturally start with or have. And for anybody who makes compost or you purchase compost, if you've ever made it before, you know that you take grass clippings and leaves and pine needles and everything, you put it together in a great big pile. As it composts, it shrinks and it turns to a pile about half the size of what you started with. So it's going to decompose very, very quickly and shrink, and then get down to a point where it's going to decompose very, very slowly after that. That stable fraction that's most of the way decomposed but will continue to decompose a little bit more is called humus. And that's very, very important and beneficial to have in your soil because that's what plants really, really like. So some benefits of organic amendments: it helps to condition the soil, improves the tilth, that's the physical structure of your soil. Like I said, it holds the water and nutrients, provides chemical buffering, helps to keep the pH stable. The pH won't bounce up and down. That's the part of the soil that helps to support the soil microbes, the microbial activity in your soil. It can contribute quite a few nutrients, macronutrients, and a lot of compost helps to provide all the different micronutrients that plants need in really tiny amounts, but they still need them. If you make compost from a lot of different ingredients, it's probably going to provide most of the micronutrients. You're never going to have a serious deficiency. And then organic acids help convert those insoluble minerals into usable nutrients that your plants can actually take up and make use of. So soil organic matter. In South Florida sandy soils, about 90% of the nutrient holding capacity is from organic matter. So if we're looking at all the different components of soil and types of soils and how well they hold nutrients, that's something that's called a cation exchange capacity. And that's a chemical physical property of different soils. That's something that we can actually test in a lab. The one thing that has the worst cation exchange capacity and does not hold nutrients well at all is pure sand. So pure sand has good drainage, but doesn't hold nutrients. Things at the other extreme that hold nutrients really well, certain types of clays hold nutrients extremely well, but they don't drain really well. So once again, good and bad. But something that does hold nutrients really, really well and drains well also is organic matter or compost. So you see, compost, I hate to use the term as a cure-all, it's going to fix every problem, but it fixes a lot of problems when it comes to your soil. So all the different nutrients the plants need that can be supplied by the soil that they're growing in. And if you look at how many different nutrients are required for plant growth, scientists can't even agree on the exact number. So if you look at different charts or different lists, they're going to vary a little bit in the number. But the things that everybody agrees on, the macronutrients that plants need in fairly large amounts, are going to be things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Things that are used in slightly smaller amounts are going to be calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then plants have a lot of different micronutrients they need in very, very tiny amounts. And different plants need them in different amounts. So things like iron, manganese, zinc, copper, boron, molybdenum, and chlorine. Some plants really aren't fussy with micronutrients at all. Turf grass, your front lawn doesn't really care about those micronutrients. We don't even know exactly how important they are to healthy turf grass growth. Researchers are still looking at that, but they're not really, we've never seen nutrient deficiencies with those in somebody's lawn. But something like palm trees are very fussy with their micronutrients. If your palm tree is really seriously deficient in boron, which is only needed in really, really tiny amounts, it will do really bizarre things and it will grow multiple growing points. It just does really, really unusual things. It's not going to grow well. Palm trees are also really fussy when it comes to manganese, magnesium, what else? Iron to a certain extent, potassium. So you really have to look at the plant you're talking about. Some plants are very, very particular with micronutrients. Other ones, not so much. So in a vegetable garden, healthy vegetable plants need access to all these different micronutrients. But if you make and add a lot of compost, quality compost, that helps provide them. And then if your soil or your plant is deficient in them, you would use a fertilizer to add what your soil is short on. So with different plant nutrients, they're broken up into anions and cations. So it could have a negative charge or a positive charge. Now, soils naturally have a very slight negative charge. So if you see here, here's a component of clay or organic matter. So what happens is if you fertilize, it holds on to the positively charged ions. Doesn't really hold on to the negatively charged ions very well. So some of them can leach and be lost in the soil and lost from your plants. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes into soil science. And like I said, if you guys really want, we could do more advanced classes on that. I'm always looking for suggestions and ideas of what, to do in these little classes. Thursday around noon is a perfect time for me. So we'll go ahead and keep planning them, and I'll keep posting them on Facebook. And the nice thing about Facebook Live is when you do it on Facebook Live, it gets saved as a video. So you can watch this after the fact whenever you get a chance to. You can watch it over and over if you like. But basically the takeaway message is healthy plants are going to do the best at nutrient uptake. So if your plant is properly watered, properly taken care of, grown at the proper time of year, a healthy plant takes nutrients up the best. Uptake, or the way it takes up the nutrients, it's related to a lot of things, environmental factors, things like temperature, things like hydration. Sorry about that. We got a little Amber Alert on the phone. So how well your plants take up nutrients is related to environmental factors. Heat, humidity play into the equation, temperature, water, whether your plant's deficient in water or properly watered or evenly watered. So that plays into cultural practices. Watering are linked to uptake. A dry plant that's not taking up water cannot take up nutrients very well because it takes up most of them right in the water component. It takes into the roots. So if your plant is suffering from those other things, sometimes people like to just throw fertilizer at the problem, thinking that's what's going to fix it. A lot of times that's not going to fix it. Sometimes the appropriate solution is fertilizer. Maybe your plant is deficient in a certain nutrient that you need to fix, but you need to figure out what the problem is first before you just start throwing fertilizer or water or neem oil or pesticides or things like Epsom salts on it, because it might not be the correct solution for your problem. So when you're thinking about fertilizing, we always try to teach people, don't just fertilize for the sake of fertilizing. Don't fertilize because it's May 1st or April 1st or a certain day on your calendar comes up. Don't fertilize just because it's spring or because your plant doesn't look really healthy or good. You need to have a reason to fertilize. So there are legitimate reasons to fertilize plants. One is to achieve a desirable plant response. That might mean that you want your plant to grow faster. You might want it to look more attractive. Maybe your plant is flowering, in which case it probably needs more phosphorus and potassium. Maybe it's a plant that has flowers that have turned into fruits, things anywhere from a tomato plant to a peach tree, and it might need additional nutrients, things like phosphorus and potassium once again. Or if your plant's deficient in a certain nutrient, you may have to fertilize it to correct that nutrient deficiency. So it could be a visual deficiency, or what commercial growers do is they send off tissue testing to labs to actually test the plant tissue and measure the nutrient levels inside of it to make sure they're, in the proper zone. And that way they could tell in advance if your plant is deficient on iron or potassium or some other nutrient, and you can add it to fix that problem. So here is a diagram, and I've seen a lot of these different diagrams online, and you can very easily Google for this and find it. But diagnosing nutrient deficiencies by looking at the leaves, a lot of times the plant will tell you what it's short on. So if your plant is supposed to be green and it's looking yellowish, the most common cause of that is going to be a deficiency in nitrogen, although it could be sulfur, it could be iron. An iron deficiency is going to turn your leaves not really yellow, but almost like a white. So there are a lot of different charts out there. You can look at your plant leaf and go through the steps and see, is the symptom on the entire plant? Is it all the new leaves, the old leaves? And go through step by step here to give you an idea of what your plant may be deficient in. If you choose to send off a soil sample, and University of Florida does this, and we do this at our extension office, most extension offices do offer this. You can send off for a soil test, and University of Florida, they don't test for all the different micronutrients. You have to request that, and that's going to obviously additional charge. But they will test for phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and one or two other micronutrients. And if your soil is deficient in those, they will tell you that, and they'll give recommendations for how much to add to the soil. You tell them what you're trying to grow, whether it's palm trees, vegetable garden, turf grass, because they already know that they have different requirements. And then when they make recommendations to what you should add, they're making them knowing what you're trying to grow, and they can make correct recommendations. So a couple different terms you might see when it comes to fertilizers. A fertilizer blend is where they have different nutrient sources all mixed together to make one type of fertilizer for a specific purpose. So maybe you've seen citrus fertilizer before, or palm fertilizer. Using those on citrus trees and palm trees is important because both citrus and palms are very, very fussy when it comes to their micronutrients. They need certain micronutrients in certain amounts. So citrus fertilizer is going to have them in the right amounts, and a palm tree fertilizer is going to have them in the right amounts. So little helpful hint number 2 for today is palm trees are really fussy when it comes to micronutrients, and they're going to do the best if you use a quality palm tree fertilizer on them. Palm trees absolutely hate being fertilized with turf fertilizer. So if you have palm trees in your lawn with turf grass around them, if either you or your service fertilizes them with turf fertilizer, it might kill your palm tree over a couple of years. They really, really don't like it because turf fertilizers have a lot of nitrogen, and palm trees don't like that much nitrogen, and it starts to throw all the other nutrients in the soil out of whack for your palm tree. Lots of nitrogen is going to make your grass green and grow really well. Too much nitrogen is going to make your palm tree very, very sickly and potentially die in a few years. So quality palm tree fertilizer for the palm tree, quality turf fertilizer for your turf grass if it needs it and when it needs it. So the fertilizer grade is going to be the percentage by weight of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you go to the store and you look at a big bag of fertilizer and it's 10-5-5, or the most common ones you're going to see are 6-6-6, 10-10-10, 16-4-8 is really common for turf fertilizer. The first number is the percentage of nitrogen that's in the bag of fertilizer. Second number is the percentage of phosphorus that's in the bag of fertilizer. The third number is the percentage of potassium, or K. So a complete fertilizer contains all three of them. It's going to have 10-5-5 or 16-4-8 or 6-6-6. It has some of all of them. Other fertilizers may contain just nitrogen, and that's going to be like a, let me think of urea, I think it's like 48-00. That's just nitrogen. No phosphorus, no potassium, no micronutrients, just nitrogen. So if that's what you need in your particular situation, that's what you're going to buy. Complete fertilizer contains some of everything, so it's going to provide a wide variety of different nutrients. But what fertilizer you purchase, you're going to base on what you need and what the situation is. A couple other terms here real quick. Inorganic or synthetic fertilizers, these are things that were mined out of the ground. Here in Hernando County, we have mines. Mining is very important here for the local economy. And one thing that they do mine is phosphate rock. That's what they get phosphorus from to provide that middle number in the bag of fertilizer that you might purchase. Organic fertilizers are derived from the remains or byproduct of something that was alive before. So there are a lot of high quality organic fertilizers on the market now, if that's what you like to use in your vegetable garden. Just realize that synthetic fertilizers are all in a chemical form that when you add them to the soil and water them in and they dissolve, the plant, whether it be a grass root, a palm tree root, or a tomato plant root, can take those nutrients up immediately, right away, because they're in a chemical form that they can take up. A lot of organic fertilizers are in a chemical form where they have to be broken down a little bit more by the bacteria in the soil before the nutrients are available for the plants. So many times an organic fertilizer, if you fertilize with your plant with that today, the nutrients are not available to the plant today. There's going to be a certain lag time before it breaks down a little bit more and the nutrients are available. A good part about them is they are usually very good slow release fertilizers. So an organic fertilizer is going to break down and release the nutrients over a period of time. Whereas the inorganic or mined or synthetic fertilizer gives your plants the nutrients they need, but they're very quickly and easily washed away. So water soluble or quick release fertilizers are something, like I said, totally dissolvable in water. You put down the fertilizer, you add the water, it dissolves, boom. It can be used by the plant immediately, but if it rains really heavy that afternoon, it could be washed away very quickly also. A slow release fertilizer is something that releases nutrients slowly over a period of time. And they make a lot of slow release fertilizers now. If you think Osmocote is a very commonly used one, people use to houseplants and ornamentals. What it is, think of an M&M. An M&M is a little piece of chocolate candy that's covered by a hard candy coating. And they say that M&Ms melt in your mouth and not in your hand. That's because of the candy coating. So slow release fertilizers are kind of the same way. It's a little granule of fertilizer that could contain nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients, all depending on the brand and the formulation, and it has a coating. Over time, water is going to wear away that coating. Bacteria and microbes are going to chew on that coating. It's going to break down, and now the fertilizer inside can be released. And that happens to individual particles over a period of time. So you can put an Osmocote or slow release fertilizer down, and over time it's going to break down, be released. It's always giving your plant a little bit of fertilizer at a time over a long period of time. So that's how those work. Very important that you actually read the labels on fertilizers and understand what you're purchasing, what it's made from. The fertilizer ratio is the relationship among the grades. So like I said, 10-5-5 has a ratio of 2-1-1. So in a bag of 10-5-5, that would be 10% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, 5% potassium. So there's 2 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus and 1 part potassium. So in a lot of instances, this isn't that important, but you could tell from the numbers, this fertilizer, out of all the nutrients in it, is reasonably high in nitrogen and lower in other things. So this would probably make a good lawn fertilizer, but probably not a very good ornamental plant. Maybe not even so much for growing vegetables, because it has a lot of nitrogen in it, which makes plants grow well, which is what you want from your lawn. But if you fertilize tomatoes with this and you give them too much of it, your tomatoes are going to grow like crazy. They're going to be green. They're going to be 8 feet tall, but you're going to have very, very few tomatoes on it, because what actually promotes the flowering and the tomato fruits is phosphorus and potassium. So you have to find the right fertilizer for the right situation. And then, of course, all fertilizers have the ingredients about what went into the fertilizer. And this does look like something you would have covered in high school chemistry class. Ammonium sulfate, potassium phosphate, potassium chloride, urea, copper sulfate. Obviously, copper sulfate is going to provide copper, which is an essential plant nutrient, and sulfur. which is also an essential nutrient. So if you're interested, you should read the ingredients to find out what you're purchasing and what went into it. So these are all different things that can go into commercially available fertilizers.